Compounding features basically just puts more funnels in a smaller area. It's increasing and multiplying your chances of success is what it's doing. We know that benches tend to magnetically draw deer, saddles tend to magnetically draw deer, and drainages tend to draw deer and funnel deer, as well as benches and saddles. They all draw and funnel deer, and deer use them quite commonly. If you can find two of those features together, or even add a flat to that, or a land bridge close by, if you can find a land bridge that's close to a flat that leads to a bench that passes a draw on the way to a saddle, you have found gold. The more of those that you can put together, the higher your odds are that there's going to be a lot of deer movement through that area. And if there's a lot of deer movement through that area, you're going to get a lot of buck movement through that area.
Chuck Young.
Yes.
I'm happy to be here, man.
I'm happy to be here too. I'm home.
It's good to have you back on, man. It's been 3 years or 4 years.
I think it's
Something
been.
like that.
I think it's been 3.
Yeah,
Clearly before
Maybe
Piper was born.
4.
it was definitely before Piper was born.
Yeah, I think it was.
It was
2022.
2022.
I think it was 4 years. 2020.
Yeah, I think
Was
it
it
was 2022.
2022?
I think so. But man, when we first had you on the podcast, we had so many people write in who were so fired up about what we talked about with you, because we talked about the terrain features and we talked about hunting off the ground.
Right.
And it was really approachable. It was really useful information for a lot of people. And we do the listener success stories. I know you're not on social media, but we have a form on our website where people write in when they have success off of the show. And so they'll send us a picture, they'll tell us a story of how they were successful, and then we share that on our social media accounts. And man, we had a bunch come in from your episodes. Like, man, Chuck Young talking about shelves or benches or land bridges, this and that.
Yeah.
And man, it just made a difference for a lot of people.
That's great. That's great. Education is a great thing. I didn't know a lot of that because, like I say, I got started late. I didn't get started until I was 35 years of age. And most of what I've learned just on my own from seeking knowledge and reading, because things like this podcast weren't available back then. There wasn't a lot of video available on anything. Hunting videos were still pretty primitive at that point in time when I started, So you just had to reach out and try and look for the information wherever you could find it. I mean, just to get a quad topo map, then I had to order it, from the U.S. Geological Survey in Little Rock, And I paid a lot of money for a lot of topo maps covering about half the state of Arkansas. Because when I started hunting, I tried to take on way too much, way too fast. I came to a point to where I had to put the brakes on and go, we're going to have to limit this range just a little bit.
Oh, that's actually a good subject. I just want to touch on that briefly right out of the gate.
All right.
Because I did the exact same thing in Alabama. When I got out of high school and I had more freedom, I could kind of drive around, I could go where I wanted to. I started hunting all over the whole state. And then when I got into college, I started going to different states. I started hunting in Georgia and Tennessee as well. And the more I did that, the more decrease in success I had.
Yeah.
Right? So was
Point of
it the same
diminishing
thing?
returns.
Yeah, it was. So are you saying it was kind of the same thing for you?
It was
like
kind of the
spread
same thing
yourself?
for me, but I was smart enough to at least stay in one state.
I was not.
Sorry, that was no insult.
No. So with you, like when you say that, like just talk about that a little bit.
Well, I was putting in for draw hunts at WMAs and things like that I was just in over my head. I didn't have enough knowledge at the time I was just still learning how to hunt and just spreading myself too thin, So I realized after trying to do that for a few years that I just thought about it and analyzed the situation and went, I'm really not that great at hunting yet. Maybe I should just try to take on a smaller area and get more intimately familiar with where I'm living, and take advantage of all these millions of acres of land that are around me, find something that's close and concentrate on it that I can maximize, spend more time in, get over there quickly, get home quickly, get rested quickly, and be able to hunt more days and spend more time and just intimately get familiar with that area and the trails and the topography and whatever is available, and learn from it. And I spent 5 years walking ground. I spent more time walking, scouting than I did hunting for the first 5 years that I did that once I made that move. And just looking at where all the deer trails were and trying to figure out, why are they here? And then at some point, the light just turned on and I realized that these guys are using terrain features. I'm seeing repetition of certain patterns, even in slightly different places on one mountain. Okay. And then once I started seeing that, maybe I expanded a little bit and gone to a different mountain in a slightly different area and looked for the same thing and found it. And it started coming together, the repetition of these patterns and realizing that I'm doing the wrong thing trying to hunt deer sign. I need to hunt topography is what I need to do. I need to hunt topographic funnels to increase my odds of seeing good bucks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one reason I wanted to just hit that right off the top is just because, especially nowadays, there's so much on social media, on YouTube, hunting shows, everything that really glorifies traveling to hunt, which we do, we enjoy, and there's nothing wrong with it. But especially if you feel like you're still trying to get good at hunting, it's probably better to buckle down and just hunt close to home, and just kind of get your feet up under you.
I'm in total agreement. So I think that's the best thing that anybody that's getting into it could do is just concentrate on, in the beginning, on one tract of land. Walk that land out, get familiar with it, and hone your hunting skills. You're going to make mistakes no matter where you start. You're going to make a lot of mistakes, but you learn from them. Every time you learn, you get better. Mm-hmm. It's a long road. Mm-hmm. No matter who you are, it's a long road. But things like y'all's show, I think, can really majorly cut down the time that it takes people to learn. It's a valuable tool. More people should listen.
Chuck, when you got started, you said you were 35?
35.
When you got started deer hunting. When did you start meeting other successful mountain hunters when you started focusing more on the mountains?
When did I start meeting?
Yeah, more successful hunters, and what were they doing?
I didn't meet that many successful hunters. I've always been kind of a lone wolf, tried to stay away from people. I was a musician for a living for a lot of years and then tons of large crowds of people. And when I wasn't around music, I just wanted to be away from people. I wanted to be isolated. That's why I really enjoy being in places in the woods where I don't encounter other hunters and don't see an orange vest anywhere. I like the isolation, and it's easy to get that in the mountains. So in answer to a question about when did I start seeing other hunters, I really probably didn't until I'd kind of already started getting established as being a decent hunter myself, I had spoke to you earlier about a guy that I know named David Lopez, who I consider a really fine hunter in the area. I had already killed quite a few decent good bucks before I actually met David, and I just so happened to be introduced to him by a fellow musician, and that's probably the first time I ever spoke to another hunter who had pretty much the same mindset that I had learned through my own mistakes to have, So I more than anything else, I've learned from mistakes, and like I said, a whole lot of reading.
So I want to talk. I kind of want to jump into the topography aspect. Mm-hmm. You mentioned early on, and you mentioned this in past episodes, but there's a lot of our audience who probably isn't familiar with you, just because of the change of audience over the last few years and growing audience. But you've talked previously on past episodes with us, and also just couple minutes ago that you started buying topo maps,
Yeah.
topography maps, and started reading those and learning those on a lot of this piece of public land. When you started doing that and you started just walking, what were the terrain features that you started seeing correlation with a certain terrain feature where you were seeing an increase in deer sign or deer movement or anything like that?
More than anything else, two things. Where I really started noticing, well, I'd say three things more than anything else right off the bat, once I started getting out and walking the land. And walking the land then, that's another skill I had to learn too, was how to use a map and a compass, because there was no Onyx, there wasn't any app like that, there was no smartphone. So I pretty much had to learn how to triangulate, and I had to teach myself how to do that. Once again, it's just reading, just a little bit of self-research. If you seek the knowledge, you'll find it if you want it badly enough, and I wanted it badly enough that I found it and I taught myself. And so I went out, the first time I went out in the mountains after I moved out here into the mountains without a compass by myself, I got turned around, And so every time after that, I always carried my map and my compass with me, But what I started noticing right off the bat more than anything else is three primary features where deer trails always ran. And one was at the heads of draws. I was always finding deer trails at the heads of draws, which, if you need an explanation, y'all know what it is, but for anybody out there that doesn't know what it is, a draw is basically a creek or water drainage running off the side of a minor, secondary, or major ridge. It could run off of either one, but it's eroded a crack in the surface of the ground, basically. And so it's a trench or a ditch, Well, the head of that is where it runs into the secondary or the major ridge, where it ends on the ridge. At the bottom, it usually tends to be not much of a funnel. It's usually a little wider down at the bottom than it is at the top, and deer could be crossing it at the bottom, but the problem in the mountains with trying to hunt something like that down low is the swirling wind conditions, So you're better off staying up on high ground, in my opinion. Wind's a lot more predictable, a lot more forgiving. You do have to take thermals into account, but we'll get into that later. The second topo feature, to try and move on quickly, would be saddles, low points and ridges. Some saddles are, not all saddles are equal. Some are better than others, and I find that most of the better saddles usually tend to be better saddles because of bedding being on one side of the saddle and the food being on the other side of the saddle. There has to be a reason that deer want to cross at that low point. Deer are prey animals. They have to have energy in reserve. They never know when they're going to have to use that energy. So they're not lazy, but they're not going to unnecessarily expend energy if they don't have to. So if they see an easy way out, most of the time, especially does, they're going to take it. So if they see a ridge with just a slight little dip in it, like this, just a slight dip, they may or they may not use that. But if it's an accentuated saddle where on one side you've got maybe a decent rise, but the other side you've got a huge rise, that's the ones that I look for. The ones that are a little more extreme. They have a much stronger low point in that saddle. It looks like the saddle on a horse. Looks a lot more like it, Well, that's what a saddle is. It looks like the saddle on a horse. It's a low point between two high points. But the more exaggerated it is, I find the better it is. And like I said, though, you could find one of those and still not find a lot of good deer sign in it. And I think most of the time the reason is because you don't have bedding on one side, don't have food on the other side. And that can vary from season to season. That food moves around from season to season. Sometimes you don't have the same mast one year that you had the next. And so the saddles and how useful they are can sometimes move around from year to year. If you find one that works every year, you're on to something really, really good. And it seems like you can also find places in the mountains where you can find a pure wind. It seems like no matter what the wind is doing, except for maybe one direction, you'll find the wind is pretty consistent and it always blows in the same direction or off the same shoulder every time that you hunt in that area, as long as the wind isn't really roaring and out of control. So that's another thing to pay attention to when you look at places in the mountains too. It's not only good to find a good topographical feature, but it's also good to find a place where wind is consistent from day to day, from wind change to wind change. And if you look around and try enough places, you will find places that are like that, and those turn out to be real honey holes. It's, they live or they die by their nose, and you've definitely got the wind to your advantage in a situation like that, okay? Saddles, heads of draws or drainages, okay? Now, the third feature that I was talking about is benches. Okay, benches are like a drainage bonus, because most of the time a bench is a chunk of land that sits off the side pronounced of a ridge. You've got your ridge, it could be a secondary ridge, but most of the time it's the main ridge. Secondary ridges, main ridges are the big ridge, okay? The secondary ridges are the lower ridges that run off the sides of that ridge. If the main ridge is running east and west, hypothetically, then your secondaries for the most part are going to be running north and south off of that ridge. If it's running north and south, the main ridge, then your secondaries would be running east and west, okay? And of course they can come off at angles, southwest, northeast, etc. Sometimes a finger can split and turn into two finger ridges. I call them finger ridges. Some people call them secondary ridges. Some people call them points, but they're all the same thing, Okay, well, a bench is a chunk of land like I've seen sometimes just triangular, flat-shaped things. Sometimes they're long and shaped like a football. Sometimes they're just little round things with a little bit of elevation on them. But basically what they all do is they neck into the ridge. There's a low point of ground where they run into the ridge, And when you have a chunk of land sitting on the ridge like that, in order to create that, you've got erosion on either side of it. So you've got a drainage or a draw on either side of that bench. So when you hunt above a bench, you're basically hunting above the heads of two draws, which is a funnel in itself in the mountains. And so then actually you're hunting two funnels at the same time and doubling your chances of success because it's where two funnels come together. Another great thing about benches in our area, I don't know if it's the case in all areas, but here in the Ouachitas, there's usually a lot of food on benches unless they've been reforested, and a lot of this national forest land out here in the Ouachita Mountains, it's okay to say Ouachita Mountains.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where we live. I don't think I'm giving too much away there. It's a pretty large chunk of land. It's millions of acres, Come one, come all. So, but, you've got the bench usually has good food on it. It's a place where does like to come and feed. It's hard for anything below a bench to see what is on that bench. It's hidden, so deer feel secure on benches, and the land is usually got a flat spot behind the bench, so it's easy terrain for a deer to run on too. They don't have to expend a lot of energy. So they like to use these benches to bed on. They like to use them to feed on. They like to use them as a travel route, So those are the three main ones. Of course, there's more than that.
All right, guys, we got another in the field tip for you today. One thing we're doing right now while we're out here scouting is looking at overlooked spots and overlooked by us. One thing we always do while we're in the field is using our tracker on onX Hunt to be able to not only see where we've gone, but where we haven't been, and that's what we're gonna go look at. So today, we're actually gonna work up into a drainage that we haven't been to before. We've walked all around it, but we haven't been up in it. And again, it's a very important factor of using the tracker so you can see where you have been and where you haven't. A lot of times those places you haven't been is your overlooked spots. So if you want to try onX Hunt, you can download onX Hunt today and use the code SOUTHERN and save 20% on your membership.
So it might be the off season, but we're still always thinking about whitetails. And if you're looking to get more mobile this fall and you're looking at saddle setups, the two most common designs you're going to see are a single panel design or a double panel design. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. A single panel design is going to be more comfortable right out of the box, while a double panel design is going to be much more adjustable and customizable to your fit. We always say on the podcast, saddles are kind of like boots. Different people are going to like different things. As a general rule of thumb, I found that heavier set guys typically like a single panel more than they like a double panel. But other than that, it's just really a matter of preference. I personally use both of these saddles. This is the Method 2 from Latitude, and this is the Lone Star from Latitude. I will say that the Method 2 is really nice because it's a 2-panel design. It's almost like you have a built-in back band that'll take a little bit of pressure off your back when you're sitting down. But if you're just getting into saddle hunting and you want something that's extremely comfortable right out of the box, the Lone Star is going to be your go-to. It has an advanced hip pinch reduction system in it, so right out of the box, this is going to be very comfortable, and you're not going to have the hip pinch issues that a lot of people have when they first get into saddle hunting. So if you want to be more mobile this fall, check out latitudeoutdoors.com to see these 2 saddles and a bunch of other mobile hunting gear. We've enjoyed them a lot, and I think you're going to enjoy them too. So outside of turkey calls and a shotgun itself, my favorite piece of gear I've ever bought when it comes to turkey hunting is a red dot sight. My new favorite is the Vortex Viper enclosed red dot. So most of the time, I'm just using the 3 MOA dot. I like just a clean single dot in my sight picture, nice and open sight picture. But I've already run into some situations this season where I'll actually switch to the reticle that is a 3 MOA dot with a 32 MOA circle around it. And the reason I like that reticle is because it allows me to see my nice little point of aim where I'm going to put that dot on the turkey's wattles, but also that circle is going to show me roughly where my pattern is going to go. And for me, it just makes it a little easier to visualize where my pattern is going through the woods, which helps me determine whether or not there's too much brush in front of me, or whether half my pattern's gonna catch something between me and the turkey that I don't want it to hit. So I really like that multi-reticle option, and I think you're gonna like it too. So to check it out, along with everything else that Vortex offers, head on over to vortexoptics.com, or you can just hit the link in the description of this show.
But the 3 main ones, I want to stay on the 3 main ones right now. How would you rank them from your favorite to your least favorite, but still good of the 3?
Favorite, if I gave it more of a chance, it could possibly be the drainages, and I'll tell you why I've avoided that mostly over the years in just a moment and explain that to you. But I would say the favorite, I couldn't include drainages because I don't have enough personal experience at them. The 2 that I do have a lot of experience at is saddles and benches, and if I had to choose one of the 2, it would definitely be benches.
Okay. So, okay.
And I think it's mostly because of the fact that you've got, a saddle is basically one funnel. A bench, you're hunting above 2 funnels. You've got 2 drainages coming up on either side of that bench. So, the potential is better.
Now, when we're talking about the heads of ditches, the benches, and then also the saddles, you're talking about like food's a big factor, bedding's also a big factor. When you're dealing with benches, is it more so food source and travel corridor, less about bedding on a bench?
I think it's less about bedding and more about travel corridor than anything else.
Okay.
But, a lot of these places out here in the Ouachita Mountains, there's a lot of open hardwoods. And as y'all know, when there's a lot of open hardwoods, there's food everywhere. On a good mast year, there's food everywhere. And so that's why I think food is not necessarily the most important part of the equation. It's just, it's been my experience over the years that deer really, really, really like, and especially bucks, like to side hill up drainages in the mountains. And I find a lot of trails running side hills, coming up drainages. And you've got the potential there on both sides of that bench for bucks to come up from either side. And that's not really easy travel. It's not easy for a buck to climb a mountain, but if you'll notice when they do, you very seldomly find a deer trail that just goes straight up and down. It's always at an angle. They're taking the easy way out. They're climbing the terrain slowly over distance. And these drainages kind of do that. They're not down in the bottom of the drainage where they have to fall over a bunch of collapsed timber and large rocks that have rolled down from erosion and things like that. They're side hilling up near the top, but they're staying down just low enough over the top to where they're not silhouetted and can't be seen easily if somebody's looking at the top of that ridge on level with it. They're just staying down below the top just to where they're hidden. But it's an easy way for them to travel, to side hill.
Now, I want to ask, and I want to cover this with you about how do you like to set up on a bench. How do you like to set up a saddle, but also a ditch? But I want to talk about ditches first. With ditches, why haven't you given ditches as much time and opportunity as you should?
Because I am predominantly a morning hunter. I guess I'm more predisposed to it personality-wise. I don't know. I just really, really enjoy seeing the sun come up in the morning. I like navigating in the dark to where I'm going. It's a challenge that I like. It excites me to take on a challenge. And I like the challenge of navigating in the dark. It was really, really fun when I was using a map and compass. It's a whole lot easier with Onyx. A whole lot easier. And I'll confess, I use it. I'm taking the easy way out. I still carry the compass, but it doesn't get used that often anymore. Anyhow, instead I'm using the compass on Onyx, But what was the question again?
But with ditches, why haven't you given ditches
okay.
much of a
So
chance?
I'm more predisposed to being a morning hunter. It's not only a personality thing. I've just, over the years, I've hunted mornings, I've hunted afternoons, and I've just had a lot more luck, especially with bucks, in the mountains in the morning than I have in the afternoons. In the afternoons, it seems really, really hard a lot of times to pick where the deer are coming down, and then you're playing thermals, so you want to be low on the mountain instead of high on the mountain. But a lot of times in these high-pressured areas that I hunt, deer don't come off the top of the mountain until right at dark, And so if you're just hunting by the old rule of hunt high in the morning and hunt low in the evening, a lot of times you're so low that those deer are not anywhere in that low area that you're in until well after dark, and you've already left the area and gone home. Because they're pressured so hard and they've been educated so much over the years, they know to stay up there even after the thermals stop falling. It's just what hunting has conditioned them to do. And so due to that, I find by going up in the dark in the mornings, if I do bump a deer, it's my personal belief from experience that I don't think deer get turned inside out and spooked nearly as much if you bump a deer in the dark, because it seems like they instinctively know that they're not being hunted at that point in time. Maybe that might not be the case if you were hunting in an area where a lot of people were poaching deer at night. So I guess the areas that I'm hunting, that's not happening because I'm not experiencing that. So I'd rather bump one in the dark, and so if I get up there and I get above a draw, what thermals are going to do above the head of a draw early in the morning before the sun comes up, the sun hasn't heated that air. And so the air, you have to kind of think of it like water. Picture the air like water. Water is going to drain to the lowest point. Cold air does the exact same thing. So that draw being the lowest point right there on the mountain, if you're at the head of that, early in the morning before the sun hits that area, your scent is going to suck right down that draw. You might catch a deer that's crossing, side hilling, and going to go around the head of that draw, which is what all these trails for the most part do. But usually if it's a draw with a lot of deer activity and a lot of deer movement, you're going to find usually on both sides of that draw a side hill trail coming up one side and the other side, and they'll work one side or the other depending upon what the wind currents are doing that day. So it helps you to pay attention to that as far as if you want to hunt farther down the draw and try and cover one of those trails, play the wind. Make sure you play the wind and stay on that side later in the day, after the thermals stop dropping. But I don't have a lot of experience because I'm an early morning hunter, and I don't want to be above those draws because I know that's exactly where my scent is going. And I've seen so many bucks come up those draws over the years that I don't want to tip them off to the fact that I'm up there hunting them. If I'm up above a bench, I'm not directly above the draw, because the draws are a bench is usually fairly sizable. If it's too small, I don't usually try and hunt it, at least not early in the morning. I look for something a little bit bigger. And then your draw, the two of them are separated and they're a little farther away from them. And I'm a ground hunter also. I gave up hunting out of tree stands a long time ago, and I think a bench does something. I don't know exactly what it does because I've never put off a smoke bomb like y'all have and watched the air currents. But I know just from experience of hunting that deer don't usually, when they come up those draws, smell me in the mornings. The wind hunting above that bench, and that's what I usually do. I don't hunt on the bench facing the mountain. I've seen a lot of tree stands over the years covering the woods where people do that, and I don't know whether they're successful at what they're doing or not. But for me, what works being on the ground is being above that bench and looking down on it. And then also that gives me an advantage too, because if the deer do come up the draw or mosey onto the bench, it's like I'm in a tree stand already, even though I'm sitting on the ground. I've got an elevation advantage over them, and I have plenty of time to get prepared for the shot before the deer ever notices I'm in the area.
And so you kind of answer two things at once, answering why you don't hunt the draws in the morning and also how you set up on benches.
Exactly, because you would ask me that.
Now,
earlier.
How do you set up on saddles?
Okay.
How do you like to hunt a saddle?
Okay, as far as hunting a saddle, it's been my experience that deer just as often, they don't necessarily just cross in the low point of a saddle. I think it's a lot more common for a deer to round a saddle. They'll come off of, okay, if the main ridge is theoretically running east and west, and the majority of the ridges in the Ouachita Mountains do that. There's a few of them that will run southwest to northeast, some kind of an angle, but the majority of them, the main ridges run east and west in this area of the mountains. And so as far as a saddle goes, what I'll try and do is I'll try and scout for a trail, and it's usually up out of the center of the saddle that surrounds a low point where the saddle is going down still and it hasn't bottomed out. If you look hard enough, you'll usually find a trail. Sometimes it's faint, where the deer are moving from one side to the other. And like I said earlier, the reason for that usually is because there's usually good bedding cover on one side and there's good feeding cover on the other side. But also during the rut, that's just a really easy place for a buck to intercept all the doe trails, that are going through that feeding area, and to intercept the trails that are going to their bedding on the side of the mountain that has the bedding on it. So it can be a fantastic place to hunt during the rut. I think the biggest problem with saddles is they may not hold the biggest bucks in the woods. I think a lot of your bigger bucks get educated to saddles because I think that's the main thing that everybody that reads and watches video, I think everybody goes crazy over saddles and they get overly hunted, and a lot of bucks get educated because of that. And I think some of the ones that get a little age and grow older tend to avoid those saddles, and they'll go up a little higher than you'll usually hunt. They'll find a little sneakier way around. They may still come through the saddle, but they're going to find a different way around it than your average deer. Their trail may be a little bit harder to find. It's going to be super faint if you do find it.
So, but setting up in a saddle, do you like to sit in the middle of the saddle looking up at one of those high points, or do you like to sit off the ridge? Or
No, I like to sit right on the crown of the ridge above the trail that I'm hunting. Because like I said, I'm a morning hunter. If I stay above that trail, first of all, high on the ridge, sun's going to hit pretty early in the morning. So you're going to have the wind and the thermals to your advantage very early on. Plus, if you're sitting right on the crest of the ridge and a deer, say theoretically your ridge is running east and west like we talked about earlier, okay? And you're up above that deer. If the wind, predominantly we get northerly or southerly winds, they could be a little west or a little easterly, but predominantly they're southerly or northerly. And if you're on higher ground, sitting smack dab on the top of that ridge, you're getting true wind. That wind is not going to ever swirl at all when you're on top of that ridge. So if you're getting a north wind and that deer is circling a trail and a side hill on a level, they don't go uphill or downhill if they don't have to. They're going to stay on one level and circle around that point on that saddle. And so if your scent is above them, especially for someone like me that's sitting on the ground, I'm more prone to being smelled because I'm 25 feet, 30 feet closer to him than a tree stand hunter would be, And so since I'm on ground level, my scent is blowing right over the top of that deer, whether he comes around on the north side or whether he comes around on the south side. It doesn't matter. My scent is going right over the top of that deer, and it's rising, so I don't have to worry about getting smelled.
I want to run a scenario by you just selfishly because this is the spot that Jacob and I hunt, and it sets up kind of like a saddle you mentioned earlier. So for this example, let's say east and west running ridge, right? And let's say going from east to west, the ridge is 200 feet, and then in the saddle it dips down to like 150.
Okay.
And then you get to the other side of the saddle, it ramps back up to like 350. So big hill on one side, smaller hill on the other side. So you're saying you'll set up on that higher side.
I'll set up on
looking
the higher
down into it.
I'll set up on the higher side if the predominantly heavy trail, because first of all, I believe in hunting the does. That's just a side note. If you want to see bucks, stay with the does. The bucks will show up. At first and early in the season, most of their activity is nocturnal. You will find some deer that have the personality to move around during the daylight early in the season, but it's a very uncommon thing. I wouldn't bank on it. It's not where you want to put your money. Plan on the deer before the rut, or it's all the rut to me, whether it's pre-rut, rut, it's all part of the rut. So once that kicks in, that's going to bring a lot of deer around to daylight, So I'll look when I'm scouting at both sides of that, the low side of the saddle and the high side of the saddle, and whichever one has the heavier trail, as long as there's enough elevation on the low side that I can get above that trail, if they're using that side more than they are the high side, then I will hunt that side. But it's been my personal experience that in most situations, the heavier trail is going to be on the higher side of the saddle, because they're taking a shortcut around a much larger chunk of land. Every once in a while, if a deer is spooked or something, they may cross that ridge. If there's only a 50-foot elevation difference, they might cross where that 50-foot higher ridge is. If they're being threatened by a coyote or by a hunter or something, they may not cross at the saddle. They may cross at the higher point. But on that higher side, you can almost bet your money that they're going to find a shortcut around that high. They don't want to go up that 350 feet. So odds are your heavier trail is going to be on that side. But it always pays to look at both. Put your money where it should be. Just the heavier doe trail is going to bear the better result eventually for bucks.
Now, I've got a lot of questions, and some of them I don't remember if we ever talked about. But before I get into those, because I have some specifically on sign, what sign you hold the most value in, but I'm going to say that for a second. I do want to ask you, so we talked about heads of ditches, we talked about benches, and we've talked about saddles. And I think you've given a really good example of all those and how you like to hunt them. Again, big morning hunter. And that's a commonality we've seen with a lot of mountain hunters. A lot of mountain hunters we talk to love mornings because they want that rising thermal. They want to get the high ground on the deer and so on. So that's a common trait with pretty much all the mountain hunters. A lot of the mountain hunters that we've interviewed.
Do a lot of them like to come in early like I do?
Especially the guys that are going in a pretty good distance, yes. We've interviewed some mountain hunters that do like evenings for certain reasons, but again, a lot of the guys like going in the mornings, and
Well, and I'm like them. I like to go a pretty good distance.
Exactly. And
that's why I was curious.
And also one thing. Well, I don't want to get too sidetracked with that. One thing, I'm a morning hunter too. I love mornings because at any point, especially start getting into late pre-rut into the early rut phase, at any point of daylight hours, you could have a good buck come walking by. Versus an afternoon, it's almost like you're waiting for that last 30 minutes, 45 minutes for a buck to move. We talked about that earlier before we started recording. And I feel like there's a huge advantage in the mountains because these bucks are typically walking a pretty good distance, when you get into that timing of the season. So at any point, that buck could have been half a mile away and he's in front of you now, right. 9:30 in the morning.
It could be midday, yeah.
Exactly. Now, I do want to talk about some other terrain features that maybe you don't hunt as often, but they've been something that's reliable for you when it comes to finding sign and or hunting. I know in the past we've talked about land bridges, other compounding terrain features that maybe overlay a couple of those two or three that we talked about previously into one spot. But
And
what
flats.
so what are some other examples you found in the mountains that's been productive?
Flats. You know, when you're looking at a topography map, a lot of people say a topo map or topo map, whichever way you prefer to pronounce it. A topo map is a waste of time, a lot of people say, and I'm in total disagreement. I think it can waste you. I think it can keep you from wasting a lot of time by pinpointing areas when you scout that you can go directly to and look at and determine very quickly whether it's going to be an asset or whether it's not, you know, by the amount of sign in a given area. And historical sign can mean a whole lot when it comes to that. You may not find a lot of fresh sign, but if you find repetitive sign from years previous, old leftover scrapes with, you know, torn up branches, you know, torn up licking branches, lots of old rubs where the trees have tried to heal over, you know, you got to pay attention to that historical sign because it can mean a lot anywhere, especially in the mountains. And so a flat is a place that I like to hunt above. You know, it's look at a topo map from above and look for places where your topo lines get farther apart. You know, and really, you know, for those who don't read a lot of topo maps, you know, when the lines are really, really close together, it's really, really steep. You know, if you use Onyx, you can turn on that slope angle shading. And, you know, where your reds are, you know, it's really, really steep. If you turn on topo overlay over that, you'll find that where those lines are really close together is where that red shading is. So that red shading tells you that. You know, CalTopo shows you that type of thing too, which is another great free app that you can use that I use a lot. You know, for anybody that's not using it, I highly suggest it. You know, it also has a locator just like Onyx, you know. And it's handy to rely on more than one app, I think. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Some are better at some things than others are. You know, it's good to experiment with them all and play with them, you know. All technology is good to experiment with, you know. But the flat is a place where when you're looking at the topo map, where those lines get a little bit farther apart, you know, especially when they're a considerable amount farther apart on the side of a ridge. Well, the deer side hill the ridge for the most part where it's really steep, you know, but where that flat is, that's a chance for the deer to take a break, if you will. You know, it's easy landscape. It may not be completely flat. It may just have like a 15 to 30 degree angle on it. But if everything around it is like 45, 50 degrees or better, you can bet that the deer are going to use that flat to cover a lot of ground, especially if that line on that topo map goes on for a considerable amount of ways, like a quarter of a mile, a half a mile. You need to walk that thing and you need to check it out because odds are, for one thing, it's a little more flatter than it's a little more flat than the surrounding area, and so it's a good place to look for scrape activity because deer don't tend to put a lot of scrapes in mountains where the terrain is really steep. They tend to produce it where benches, what I call neck into the mountain, you know, where there's kind of a flat spot, you know. Sometimes it'll be a little bit flat up at the top of a creek drainage sometimes. You just have to look around and look at that topo map and find where flat spots are, where those lines are a little farther apart, and go look for sign there, you know. Another great place to look for rubs is on benches. You're going to find them in saddles as well. And a lot of times you're going to find them in those drainages and around the heads of drainages. Those are just all great places to look for historical buck rub sign, as well as fresh sign left over from the season before. And some people don't like to scout in the summer, and it's really rough scouting the mountains in the summer because, you know, when it's 90 degrees outside, it's pretty rough outside climbing mountains, you know. Put on a pair of shorts and a T-shirt. Make it easier on yourself, you know. But put on plenty of, you know, bug dope and, you know, prepare yourself to be, you know, fighting or prepare yourself to where you're not eaten alive by the ticks, you know, and mosquitoes. But get out there and scout and, you know, experiment and look for new pieces of land in the off season when you don't have to worry about bumping deer. I think that's the best thing about summer scouting or late spring scouting. You know, if you're, you know, right after turkey season ends, if you're into turkey hunting, you don't want to throw away your turkey season, but after turkey season is a real good time to start. You know, the weather is still pretty forgiving, but it pays to just keep at it if you can all summer long. For one thing, you're getting your exercise, you're building up your tolerance level, being out there climbing. When I first started hunting, I was hunting in southern Arkansas. A lot of flat ground, small rolling hills. When I moved up into this area, what a major shock. I didn't realize, right off the bat until did a little bit of reading that I really needed to be up there on that higher ground. And the first few times I went out to the mountains, I looked up there and I was like, do I really have to do this? Do I really have to go way up there to get a buck? And it was hard forcing myself to get over my laziness and just do it. But after going up there and realizing that it worked, first just observing more deer, and then second being able to kill more deer, and then third being able to kill more quality deer, it came to the point to where eventually I looked forward to climbing that mountain and seeing that sunrise in the morning because it was so beautiful being up there and seeing it from that perspective. And now, even at 67 years of age, I'm to the point to where I'll climb over that mountain and climb over another mountain and up another mountain and not even think twice about it. It's turned me into a billy goat.
So, I do want to I want to rein this back in real quick. So you're talking about flats. Mm-hmm. I'm going to come back to flats in a second, but what are some other terrain features?
Land bridges.
Okay.
Land bridges. A land bridge basically is when you have two major ridges running parallel with one another, and then a lot of times you'll find much lower down a low, what would normally possibly be called a secondary or a finger ridge that's coming off of one ridge. The only difference is that it joins and necks into another ridge. And so it basically joins two major ridges together. And the significance of that is during the rut, that can be a major funnel and hot spot on either ridge, because the deer that are over here, the bucks that are over here checking for does on this ridge, eventually those does are going to play out. When they do, that deer is going to check the next available ridge for does. Well, his easiest route of travel is not to go all the way down into the creek bottom. His easiest route of travel is to not go down as far in elevation and not waste as much energy and hit that land bridge and come across and get up on the other ridge and then just side hill his way up, cutting and intersecting doe trails. So that's what it is, really. It's just a piece of high ground that is connecting two major ridges together. And it looks like a bridge. That's exactly what it is. I don't know what other people call it, but I call it a land bridge, and that's what my buddy Clint, my hunting partner, calls it also.
So I found one in Georgia 2 seasons, well, it was 2 years ago, right?
Yeah, it was 2 years ago.
When we were hunting the mountains up there, I found a land bridge just like that. And it was still in my mind because I know you had talked about before, and we had a couple other guests. I think it was maybe Drew Atkinson in further north of where we're at in Arkansas. He talked about land bridges where it was just like that. It was like there was like these two big secondary points that run off a big mountain. Mountain was another 400 or 500 feet higher in elevation, and then there was just a spot where these two secondary points connected, and you just could walk right across it. And it was at a pretty high elevation. Like you didn't have to drop down more than maybe 40 feet to hit the land bridge. And there was scrapes. This was in September, and there were scrapes from last season. Some of them have probably still been touched up. There were scrapes all over that thing.
Did you hunt it?
I did not. It was September.
What's wrong with you?
I know. I probably should have given it a shot. It was September 14th. We were kind of bow hunting, but we're also, it was like, I think first day we were there, and we were kind of like scouting our way around trying to find feed signs.
You should have went back during the rut.
Well, it was unbelievable because on one side of the land bridge, I mean,
go back this year.
Yeah, you could, if you had just a slight running start, you could have hit a stopwatch and it probably had been 15 seconds before you hit the bottom. I mean, this sucker, it seemed like it was steep, big drop off on one side, going lower down the elevation down the creek bottom.
Yeah.
And on the other side, it was probably maybe 50-ish feet down in elevation. And it kind of like, it was almost like a big bowl that went into the mountain right there.
Right.
And there were scrapes all up and down. And I go back to thinking about what you're talking about.
How long was that land bridge between the two ridges, do you think?
Probably 75 yards, maybe 75 to 80 yards, something like that in width. But each secondary ridge was so steep and nasty, it was just the one spot you could just jump right across on. And again, it was just concentrated sun right there.
Let me ask you this. How long, distance-wise, was that land bridge from where it necked down into one mountain to where it necked down into the other? Was it a quarter mile, half mile, a few hundred,
Are you talking,
200 feet?
Are you talking?
How long was the land bridge joining the two major?
Oh, that's what I'm saying. It was probably just at 100 yards. So it wasn't
100 yards?
Yeah, it was.
Okay, well, that's prime. And the reason why I was asking that is because sometimes some of these land bridges that I've hunted on can be almost a mile or more. And sometimes they can zag back and forth. They're not necessarily straight. They can, have turns and bends in them, but it's still a land bridge that is joining two mountains together, and they neck, on either main ridge. But when you've got that, you might be able to get away with hunting, out in the middle of the land bridge, and the wind might be a little more forgiving and predictable and less swirling going on. But like you say, a lot of that swirling is going to depend on the elevation difference between that the land bridge and the major ridges that it's connected to, So that's going to dictate a lot of how much swirl you get down on that land bridge. But if it's a long land bridge and it's not that low, you might be able to actually get away with hunting and finding a good intercept spot in all those scrapes if they were on a long one. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I do find a lot of scrapes on even long ones.
Okay.
It's just a great travel corridor during the rut. You've got you've got a good hunting scenario during the rut right there where you might be able to hunt down there. But if there's a big difference in elevation, instead I would advise, odds are at each end of that land bridge, you're going to find a trail that cuts up at a right-hand angle and at a left-hand angle up the side hilling up the side of that main ridge that it joins to on either side. You're probably going to find that. One trail is used in one direction, one trail is used in the other direction, depending on how the deer need to play the wind that day. So I would advise hunting above and between those two trails a considerable distance. If you're archery hunting, don't get so far up that you're out of range to get a shot at either trail. But try and play the wind. Odds are the deer are going to play the wind and come up the trail that is on the downwind side that day. So if you have to set up closer to one side than the other, favor to that side that, favor to the side that you will be on the downwind side of.
So now that's interesting. So you're saying where the land bridge attaches to like one of those main ridges, getting when those trails did fork like you talked about, they split off one way, one went to the left, one went to the right. You're talking about staying in between them, but getting a little bit higher in elevation where you're facing the land bridges in front of you.
Right.
The trail split to your left and right. That's how you would set up.
Right. Of course, if you're in a tree stand, whatever is the dominant side that the deer are the trail that the deer are likely to cover because they have the wind advantage that day, you might need to angle your stand some to where you're not directly looking at the land bridge, to where you're at the appropriate angle to draw without being in an awkward drawing position if you're shooting a compound or a longbow or a recurve.
Well, see, that's interesting because my thought, and this is why I'm glad you brought that up, my thought would be when I saw it, and I was thinking more of the rut instead of early season, was sitting at the corner where that land bridge met the main ridge because it was just steep right there and trying to find a tree right there. But then again, you might have the deer 6 yards from you trying to come underneath you, at least on that first trail that's closest to you.
Yeah, I think it's better to kind of split the distance between the trails and get up a little bit, and then you're probably going to have more of a thermal advantage, being up a little bit higher above the deer, and you're not as likely to get seen.
Yeah.
And the other thing, the reason why I asked you about a short land bridge earlier is because that's an even better scenario, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is because, number one, the land bridge is going to funnel deer during the rut. Bucks are going to come through that land bridge, easily changing from one ridge to the next, cutting doe trails. The second thing you have to your advantage is when it's a narrow land bridge that's not narrow, but short, joining the ridges together. Then what you have is a major draw coming up either side of that land bridge. So you're not only funneling deer movement, changing from ridge to ridge, you're also funneling deer movement up the potential draws on either side of that land bridge to cut distance.
That's exactly how this one sets up. That's exactly
It sounded to me like it did. That's why I
Dang.
wanted to tell you
Sounds
that.
like we should go back.
That's a really good scenario for a rut funnel.
Okay. All right. And also, there was good bedding on. I didn't walk across the land bridge. We kind of came up to the land bridge because I could see it on the map, and then saw it, walked to the edge of it, kind of looked at it, falls and scrapes out halfway out on it. Then I didn't go to the other side and came back, but there's a thicket where there was a bunch of trees that had died, blown down, whatever, on one side of the land bridge. I don't know if the other side was like that. So like on one of the big ridges that the land bridge attached to, it was just thick and nasty right there at the head of it. And then I'm sure the other side might have looked the same. I didn't go look at it, but I mean, there was just so many scrapes in there from the past season. But that's interesting. I don't want to get too tied up in that, but for people out there that are interested in land bridge, something to go and try to find and look at.
As far as people that hunt the Ouachita Mountains, a tip that I would like to insert right here would be that if you do have a land bridge situation where it's short like that, it could even be good outside of the rut, because it's been my experience that most of these mountains out here in the Ouachitas that I have been on, the south side gets more sun because we're north of the equator. The growth usually tends to be brushier. They're usually a better side of the mountain for deer to bed on. Whereas the north side, since we're north of the equator, gets shade for a greater portion of the day. Therefore, it retains moisture from rain a lot better. And so most of your better producing mass trees in our area, at least, I don't have experience with the Ozarks because I don't hunt there, but at least out here in the Ouachitas, most of your good mass tends to be on the north side of the mountain. So when you're hunting that land bridge, if those ridges are running east and west, and most of them do out here in the Ouachita Mountains, then odds are the south side of that land bridge is probably going to be a really good feeding area because it's a north-facing slope. And the north side of that land bridge is probably going to lead to a great bedding area because it's hitting the south side of a ridge where the cover is usually brushier. And a lot of these places out here in these Ouachita Mountains, a lot of them have not been reforested, and so there's a whole lot of hardwood growth. And so a lot of times just a slightly thicker place on the south side of the ridge, just a little sawbriar thicket or something, just a tiny little growth, just a little thick spot is all it takes for a deer to bed in, And so outside of the rut, if you got food on one side, bedding on the other side, that's even more of an invitation for deer any time of the season to cross that land bridge going from one to the other.
Now, I don't want to get too far past it to bring it back up, but when you were talking about flats, how would you define, I have a pretty good idea what you're talking about, but what's the difference between a bench and a flat for you?
The difference between a bench and a flat for me is a bench is actually a separate component to me. Some people might not define it that way, but to me, a bench is almost a separate component from the mountain. It comes off the mountain and it's a large structure that sticks out off of the mountain. It may be circular, it may be oval, like a football in this direction, it could just be long and narrow. It could just be a little flat triangle that sticks out a couple of 100 yards on the mountain, but it's like a growth off of the mountain, if you will. A flat is actually part of the main ridge. It's a place where you've got lines on your topo map that are a given distance apart, and all of a sudden they widen right on the side of that main ridge, and they just stay wide for a given amount of time, and then they're probably going to eventually narrow back up again. And a lot of the time when they narrow back up again, it's because you're close to a drainage or you're close to a bench or some other type of a land feature. So a lot of times those flats funnel deer. Not only does it make it easier for the deer to walk the side of that mountain with less effort, it funnels them into another terrain feature a lot of times at the same time.
Now, also, so there's flats and land bridges, two of those terrain features. Is there any other terrain features that are noteworthy that you found in the mountains?
That's pretty much all I stick to as far as hunting-wise. Those are the ones that I'm looking for. Those are the ones I'm most familiar with. There may be others, but if there are, I'm not looking for them, and I haven't taken advantage of them. And it's something else that I still have yet to learn from listening to your podcast.
So
'Cause
now,
I'm an avid listener.
well, one big part of our conversation that we had with you the very first time we had you on was compounding terrain features.
Yeah.
How do you describe a compounding terrain features, and what is it to you?
Compounding features basically just puts more funnels in a smaller area. It's increasing and multiplying your chances of success is what it's doing. You know, we know that benches tend to magnetically draw deer, saddles tend to magnetically draw deer, and drainages tend to draw deer and funnel deer, as well as benches and saddles. They all draw and funnel deer, and deer use them quite commonly. If you can find two of those features together, or even add a flat to that, or a land bridge close by, if you can find a land bridge that's close to a flat that leads to a bench that passes a draw on the way to a saddle, you have found gold. The more of those that you can put together, the higher your odds are that there's going to be a lot of deer movement through that area. And if there's a lot of deer movement through that area, you're going to get a lot of buck movement through that area. If that's what you're after is buck hunting, you know, it's going to be good for a meat hunter too, because you're going to see plenty of deer activity in general, including doe activity, feeding through that area. And I think that's pretty much. It doesn't matter whether that's on a bedding side of a mountain or whether that's on a feeding side of a mountain. Just compounding features in general are going to force deer to come through the area. Like I said, the more that you add together, you're just multiplying your chances of success. So look for that when you look at your topo maps. Before you go scout, learn. It can be intimidating looking at a topo map or a topo map when you first start reading them. It's hard to tell what's high and it's hard to tell what's low, but look at the elevation marks. You know, it's going to give you somewhere along those lines, like it'll say 1,000 feet, 800 feet, 600 feet, 700 feet. Follow those lines around. And if you follow those lines around, eventually if you stare at it enough, that map is going to start to make sense to you, and you're going to be able to figure out what is the low ground and what is the high ground, and it won't be inverted or backwards. You know, once you figure that out and you get used to looking at those maps, then look for those compounding features that I'm talking about. Look for places in those topo lines where they spread apart. Look for those flats. Look for things sticking out off the side of ridges. Those are benches. Look for low points in the ridges. Those are your saddles, you know. Just look for all these features, the draws, drainages. Look for all of them. The more you can put close together, the better your odds of success.
Now, when you have them close together, and I've found spots where you'd have like a bench, two drainages coming up that lead up to a saddle up above it, okay? When you have these compounding terrain features, any kind of combination of what we've talked about so far, I know every spot that you find something like this is all different. They all set up a little bit different, but they have commonalities of just compounding terrain features, multiple terrain features in one area. How do you like to set up on that where you feel like you have the best chance and opportunity? Are you trying to get as close between two or three of them as possible, where you can kind of cover them all with a rifle shot? Or do you like to cheat over towards one where another one leads into it?
If I have a choice, I will usually set up over the bench, being a morning hunter, because I feel like the wind is usually a little more stable. For some reason, it just doesn't seem to usually, once the thermals start coming uphill, it doesn't seem to drop down where those two drainages are coming up on either side of the bench, which is where I'm expecting the deer to usually come from, if they come from below, which is usually the case. And a lot of times in these mountains, it takes time. You have to be patient. You may not see deer for the first 2 or 3 hours that you're sitting up there. Those deer take their time climbing. They don't expend excessive energy. Sometimes those deer won't show up there until 8:30, 9:30, 10:30 in the morning. Most of the best bucks I've probably killed between 10 and 11 o'clock in the morning in the mountains, hunting the high ground. And I usually look for those topo features. Also, I'll add in usually the upper third of the major mountain, whatever the major ridge is and that elevation distance between the high ground and the lowest point, I'll usually concentrate my scouting efforts into that upper third and try and hunt that area, because that upper third may not have as much overall deer movement during daylight, but that's where your better, more mature deer that have learned to use thermals to their advantage are going to tend to head, not only because of the thermal advantage, but also because of hunting pressure. A lot of hunters are lazy. A lot of hunters do not like to climb. I was one of them when I started. I learned better. You know, if you want to get after those big bucks, don't be lazy. Get out there and climb. If you give yourself a chance, you will get used to it. You just have to condition yourself to it.
Also, because I do want to, in a little bit, we're going to talk about ground hunting and how you have used that over the years and an advantage with it. But before we do that, how does specifically buck sign, but just overall deer sign play a factor for you? Like when you're scouting, what grabs your attention the most in the mountains? Because you talked about some areas, like it's really hard to find scrapes because of the steepness, and especially what I've learned in the Ozarks is so rocky in some areas. Like there's no scrape to be had. You might find a looking branch, but there's no scrape on the ground. What sign gets you excited, and what do you put more value in when you're scouting in the mountains?
When I'm scouting, the number one thing that I'm looking for is trails. Okay, if there are no trails in the area, there's just not any deer movement in the area. So you're going to want to find trails. Number two, what a lot of times will lead you to a trail, you know, because sometimes in some areas, deer movement is not defined enough to make a concise trail. It's hard to find tracks in the mountains. It's very hard to find places that are muddy, where there's not rocks all over the ground, or at least it is out here in the Ouachitas in most places. So look at your ground cover, look at your leaf litter, look for punch holes in the leaves where deer hooves have punched. You'll figure it out after a while. You'll see where the hooves have punched holes in those leaves. Look for those tracks. Follow them. If you follow them far enough, in any direction, sooner or later, you're going to run into a trail. Start following that trail in the off season. So if your scent gets on it, it's not going to disturb you or hurt anything. They'll be well over it by the time deer season comes around. If you're scouting in the postseason or after turkey season or in the summertime, you know, you don't want to do it close to season. If you know, unless it's an absolute necessity, you know, somehow your spot got ruined or logged or something happened and you've got to start fresh, then you may not have any choice. But if you have a choice about it, stay off the trails, don't walk the trails. But in the off season, walk the trails. Walk as many trails as you can. Find out where they go. Find out what features that they lead to, you know. So I would say number one would be I'm looking for trails. Number two, I'm looking for tracks, okay? A lot of times it's the opposite order. A lot of times I'm looking for tracks first because they lead to trails, you know. After that, I'm looking for rubs. I don't look for scrapes except in specific places in the mountains. The place to look for scrapes, in my opinion, in the mountains, as far as predictability, is any place where a bench necks into a mountain. You know, that is, or where a finger ridge, a secondary ridge necks into a mountain. A lot of times a finger ridge won't just come straight up like this and just hit a ridge. A lot of times it will come up and then it will go downhill just a little bit and then uphill a little bit where it hits. And so there'll be a flat spot in there. I look for those places on those secondary ridges because that, to me, is the most consistent place, or where a bench necks into a mountain. Any place where the ground has a nice flat spot, that's where you want to look for scrapes. But that's the last thing I look for. First, I look for rub activity. And when I'm looking for rub activity, I don't look for it as much up high as I do off-season walking the low ground. You know, most deer sign, in my opinion, is put down at night. Because most of the off-season deer are pretty nocturnal. You don't see near as many deer moving around during daylight hours during the off-season. And so a lot of times, you know, deer are not being pressured, they're not being hunted. You know, they're really going to town at night in these low areas where the scent has pooled, like y'all talk about a lot of times on your podcast. You know, places where several drainages combined. Let's see, what do y'all call that?
Thermal hub.
Yes, a thermal hub, you know, where all these drainages come together in a low spot. You know, those thermal hub spots down low, you know, where all that feeds together, go look there for sign. Look in those low spots. Look low in those drainages, because odds are the concentration of your sign is going to be down there. That's where the most of it's going to be. You will find sign up high if you look hard enough for it, especially during the rut when bucks get full of testosterone and they really start going at it and trying to exert themselves and show their dominance, But I look for it low first. If I find it low, then I'll look for it high above that area.
But that tells you that they're clearly using that low spot, but they're coming off the mountain. They're coming off one of these ridges, and you just got to figure out at what point are they coming off to tell you where you need to sit above them to catch them, correct?
Well, I'm not considering, because I'm not, for the most part, an afternoon hunter, and I'm mostly a morning hunter. I find a lot of guys try and hunt all day long. If you're hunting a mile in the woods, a mile and a half in the woods, even 3/4 of a mile in the woods, it takes you a while to get in there, especially if you're a tree stand hunter and hauling all that extra gear, Might be a little easier with a saddle, but you're still hauling a lot more gear than I do, carrying just a little ground seat. But even for somebody like me, it takes a while to get in, it takes a while to get out. I would rather, especially during the rut, I'm a weekend warrior, so I've got to make use of every morning that I have on that weekend. I have the luxury of working at a job that's a 4-day week instead of a 5-day week. And so I've got 3 days off every weekend. And so I'm going to be somewhere every one of those mornings. And when I'm there, I want to be fully recharged and fully refreshed and fully at my observant peak, if you will. I don't want to miss anything because I'm tired and I'm nodding out and I'm falling asleep. So I would rather sacrifice the afternoon, go home, get to bed early, get a good 8-hour sleep, get well rested, get well fed, and be ready to just go rip-roaring through the woods again the next morning and start all over again fresh, just like you did the day before, than burn myself out over that 3-day period. I'd rather have 3 shorter, solid hunts than 3 marginal hunts where I'm having a really hard time trying to stay focused and stay awake. That's just what works for me. Maybe some people are better at staying awake all day long. People's body chemistry is different. I don't know. It takes all kinds. So if it works for you, do it. But I just know what works for me. If you find yourself getting wore out, then commit to one or the other. Commit to the afternoons and commit to the mornings. So the question, what was the question again? I got off on a tangent because I'm not an afternoon hunter.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying if you're finding a bunch of buck sign down low, they're probably coming off from up top in the evenings, but they're also going back up top early in the morning.
Right. And so what I'm looking for is rubs that are facing uphill, not downhill. Sometimes a buck will work stand around a tree, as you well have probably seen on video cameras before, and he'll work it for more than one direction. But for the most part, I really think that buck rubs will generally be mostly on one side of the tree, and that usually gives you an indication. If the rub is on this side of the tree that's facing you, the buck is traveling in that direction. So if that's going uphill, odds are that is a morning route. If the rub is going downhill, odds are that is a downhill route where the deer is coming off at darkness or a little before darkness, to play the thermals and get down to the low ground. So look for those uphill and downhill rubs. If you're an afternoon hunter, look for the downhills. If you're a morning hunter, look for the uphills. Use them to your advantage.
Exactly. No, I mean, I like that. And one thing I've enjoyed about the conversation so far is everything we're talking about is simple. It's not complex.
It is.
It comes down to work effort and how much are you willing to just hike in, hike out, and scout to play to your advantage, because everything else is, I say simple, but it takes time to build confidence in doing what you've been doing for the last 30 plus years, to have the confidence that you know what you're looking for, and you have the confidence to go in there and not hunt the afternoon and just hunt the mornings, because that's when you feel the best. You want to be recharged. You want to, that's when you have the most confidence with buck movement all morning long, and you have a certain way that you hunt that, you built confidence in. but everything else that you're doing is not super complicated. You're not doing anything crazy. It's just like the work effort of getting in there and making sure you're set up in the right spot.
Yeah, it's not complex at all. And like I said, for the first 5 years that I hunted these mountains, I had to completely relearn. Not that I was a great hunter on flatter ground. I was still learning there, but then when I came to the mountains, it just blew me away. I had to completely relearn how to hunt. I've heard it said before that the two hardest types of hunting, and I don't know, different people will have different opinions about this, but when I read it, basically it said the two hardest types of hunting were mountain hunting and swamp hunting.
I was going to say the same.
And I tend to agree with that. I think you have to have a little more mental fortitude to wade around in mucky water all day where there could be alligators and no telling what, because it's murky water and you can't see what's down there. Moccasins, loggerhead turtles, no telling, It's a mystery. But the mountains are just so physically demanding, and the deer, they are so good at using that terrain to their advantage. They play it so well. The bucks that you kill in the mountains might not be as big as the bucks that you kill in agricultural land, but they are every bit just as much of a trophy animal. You really have to work for them.
Yeah, and another thing that I like about this conversation is that this is transferable to anywhere where there's mountains or significant hill country, because I was telling you earlier, the first time we talked to you is right when we started hunting more mountainous terrain in Alabama and Georgia. And that year we ended up killing several nice bucks on that place using what you were talking about. And actually, as you were sitting here discussing the compounding features, my brain just went to a spot. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited about for this fall.
Yeah, and I mean, even the thermals, that doesn't only apply to mountains. That applies to people that hunt the lowlands too. It's like I said, think of air like water. Whatever is, even if there's only a 1 or a 2 foot drop in a ditch in an area, that is where those thermals are going to at sunset when that air cools off. Think about that. Think of it, look at it as water flowing, over high and low spots. When you're on flat ground, a lot of times when the sun is just setting in the afternoon, your thermal is going to pull toward that hot sun when there is no wind at all. Things like that had to be taken into consideration. When you're hunting from a tree stand in the afternoon and you lose the sun and the thermals stop dropping, or the thermals start dropping, a lot of times scent can well up around the bottom of your tree stand to where a lot of times you're much better off in the afternoon being on the ground than you are being 25 or 30 feet up in a tree because of that pooling of scent around underneath you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great transition. The other part of this conversation that I wanted to get into was the ground hunting aspect.
I want to say one other thing before we get into that.
Okay, go ahead.
And the other thing that I wanted to talk about, golly, I think I've lost it.
Had to do something with topography, I'm sure.
No, it was this. It was that the first 5 years that I came up and had to relearn hunting the mountains, I spent a lot of time walking with a tree stand on my back and never hanging a tree stand on a tree all day long. Just walking and educating myself and trying to put together the pieces of why these trails existed in these areas. Asking yourself the why. A lot of times the why is really important. The where is important too, but the why can be important, And that's one great thing about y'all's podcast is that I had to spend 5 years roaming around in the mountains trying to figure all this stuff out. If people will listen to y'all's podcast on a regular basis, the increase in the learning curve could be really substantial. But still, when you get started, I can't stress how important it is to spend more time scouting than you do hunting. If you spend 2 to 3 times as much time scouting as you do hunting, and hunt on the best days, hunt when that cold weather comes through, hunt when those deer want to move, go out and scout during those warm days when the deer movement is not as good. Don't waste your time. Make your days effective. Make them count, and spend that time in the off season scouting, trying to figure things out and put two and two together. And if you do that, I think your learning curve to success is going to be a much shorter amount of time than what it took for me having to learn everything myself. Now we can go on to the ground.
And I appreciate that too. And also, I mean, we say it all the time that the podcast can help you shorten your learning curve, but there's no silver bullet. At the end of the day, you still got to go burn the boot leather and figure it out for yourself. We can just help you get,
exactly. And
a good place to start.
What works for one person might not necessarily work for somebody else. You're going to find a lot of different theories on the show and a lot of different attitudes and methods toward how they go about things, such as, feed tree hunting. That I'm not feed tree hunting. What I'm doing is completely different than that. But there are places in the state where feed tree hunting is the thing. It's what works for a lot of people. So there's different methods depending upon where you go in the state, and a lot of times different methods work in the same area. But you can pull pieces from all these different hunters and put it together and mold it into what is you. Because we're all unique, and you're right. You have to put in the boot leather, wear it out on the mountains and figure out what works for you. Mm-hmm. Or if you're on flat ground, same thing, boot leather, figure out what works for you. Take a piece of this, a piece of that, a piece of this, a piece of that. When you're a musician, which I was for a lot of years, you don't automatically just start with a playing style. You have this guy that you listen to and this guy that you listen to and all these people are influences, and you take a little bit of this guy and a little bit of this guy and a little bit of this guy and a little bit, and you gel all that together, and before you know it, you have a unique individual style that is a culmination of many different people, but it is uniquely you. It's the same situation with hunting.
Oh man, I love that. And on the ground hunting, I love the ground hunting conversation because some people maybe they don't have it in the budget this year to get a tree stand or a saddle, or they're tired of lugging one around and they want to try out ground hunting just as another tool to be more versatile. And you said you gave up the tree stand, like 18 years ago?
I gave the tree stand up 18 years ago, and I'm 67, so I gave it up at 49 years of age. And the reason why I gave it up is because I was a heavy smoker. I was a 3-pack-a-day cigarette smoker. I gave up cigarette smoking 5 years ago. My wife and I both laid them down at the same time, mutual commitment to each other. Neither one of us has picked up a cigarette since, and we had no longer have the desire. People can smoke around us. We still have no desire. The smell of it is actually obnoxious to us now. We are certifiable non-smokers. And awesome. It was the smartest decision I ever made in my life. I had most of my life I spent as a drummer. And as a drummer, it is a total heart workout. Not only that, but I was a lead singer as well. A dominant lead singer in most of the bands that I worked in at the same time. And so I was pulling a Don Henley, like the Eagles, if you're familiar with maybe y'all's generation. I'm sure y'all know who the Eagles are.
Yeah.
Okay, well, their drummer was their main vocalist, and basically that's what I was. And it's just it's a workout. It's a constant workout, And then I was playing, 5 days, 6 days, many years, 7 days a week when I was young for almost 15 years straight, almost 7 days a week, except for the week of Christmas every year. I stayed on the road playing drums and singing all the time. And so I think even though I was a heavy smoker, and I didn't start till I was 21, and I started because of boredom from spending so much time in towns where I knew nobody, stuck in hotel rooms with nothing to do all day, waiting to play. And it was a way to help pass time. And my father was a heavy smoker, and so I naturally took to it after I got out on my own at 21 years of age. But quitting was the smartest thing I did because I started getting to the point, once I started getting a little age on me in my upper 40s, to where I started getting a little bit winded going up these mountains. Up to age 45, I didn't notice it that much. Drumming kept me really healthy. But once I hit that 45 years of age, after doing it from 21 and smoking like 2 to 3 packs a day, every day of the week, all that time, it took its toll and it started taking away my air, and at that point in time, I knew I had to do something. I wasn't about to give up hunting, and so I gave up the cigarettes. And I'm so glad I did. I got my wind back. I don't get winded climbing anymore. I had a little bit of a health problem for the last couple of years, but I found out I was allergic to yellow dye. And so it was making me swell up in my mid-range and kind of making me get a little winded because of that. And it was kind of a hard thing to go through, but I eventually figured out what it was by narrowing down diet choices and figured out I was allergic to yellow dye, got off of that, and now I'm 100% back to health again. No problems, and I'll never smoke another cigarette again in my life. But as far as hunting from the ground, yeah, I've been doing it for like 18 years now. I quit. Like I said, I was a heavy smoker. I was afraid that I was going to get up in a tree stand 25, 30 feet and have a heart attack, from smoking so many cigarettes. I was going to have, because I smoked even when I hunted. I just tried to make sure that my smoke went the way that deer weren't going to come from.
Yeah.
And I always kept like a little baby food jar or something with me, and I flicked all my ashes in that baby food jar. I didn't hold my bow all the time. I kept it in a holder on the tree stand, and I just made sure that every ash went in that jar and every butt went in that jar, and that jar got completely sealed and put away when I was not smoking, and I would try to abstain as much as I could while I was on the tree stand, but I still did smoke when I needed to have a smoke. And once I got on the ground and quit, when I first started on the ground, I was still smoking. But like I said, once again, I tried to keep my smoke going in a direction where from looking and interpreting the sign, did not expect deer to come from. Naturally, I still got busted every once in a while by that one odd deer that did come in from the direction that I did not expect, because sooner or later that will happen to you, quite regularly, actually. You can't predict everything, We can just go by the best odds, You want the best odds in your favor that you can get. But 18 years of hunting on the ground, and I've killed my biggest deer during that 18-year period of hunting on the ground. I've been more successful hunting off the ground than I ever was hunting out of a tree stand. I think it benefits you, actually, a lot. It's taxing to carry a heavy tree stand around in the woods. I can see a tree stand being really, really beneficial to people that hunt in low hills or flat ground, because it's a lot easier to get busted. But when you're hunting in the mountains and you're hunting above, in the mornings, like I do, above the sign that you're hunting on, you're above that sign, you've got the thermals to your advantage, you're uphill above the deer that are coming in, so it's kind of like you're in a tree stand without being in a tree stand, What I like to try and do, and also comfort has a whole lot to do with how observant you are when you're hunting. When you're up in a tree stand, I don't know how y'all feel in a saddle or a tree stand, but I always felt slightly uncomfortable. They're just not the most comfortable things in the world to sit in. What I use is just a ground turkey lounger. It's got a full back in it. It sits low to the ground. In open woods, I'll have does walk within 5 yards of me and not realize what I am as long as I don't move. I think deer don't recognize the human outline easily until you stand up and get on 2 feet. When you're low to the ground like that, you look like a tree stump. You don't look like a human. It's a completely different profile, and deer don't recognize it as much. Now, if everybody started ground hunting, that might change the game. But I think right now I'm a rarity, not the majority of people. But if you can't afford a tree stand for some reason right now, don't feel like you have to have one. You can be successful off of the ground. You just have to use the elements to your advantage. A lot of times when you set up on the ground, you can look for, erosion happens a lot in the mountains. When you've got a big tree on the side of a mountain, a lot of times erosion will pile up ground on the back side of that tree and create a flat spot. That is a perfect place to set a tree lounger or a ground turkey lounger, Scrape a few rocks out of the way with your feet, do what you got to clear the area. And I like to sit behind the tree when I'm gun hunting. Bow hunting, it's a little more difficult, but if you are using a compound or you are using a recurve or a longbow, you can still sit behind that tree. What I used to like to do when I was compound hunting is I would lean my compound up against the side of the tree and sit behind the tree. And when a deer came into the area, being up high above the sign, I was always able to see the deer before the deer ever saw me. And that enabled me and bought me enough time to get set up on the deer before the deer came into the area. And then with the tree behind you, get used to shooting from a sitting position, or leave enough room behind the tree to where you can have that tree as wide as you are and get down on your knees and kneel and practice shooting from a prone position. Because I think if you try and do that sideways and practice compound shooting or recurve shooting or longbow shooting like that, I think you'll find that when you do that and you're on your feet and your knees, you got 4 points of contact on the ground instead of 2 points on the contact on the ground. When you're standing up sideways to a target and you draw on it and you try to remain steady, your body swaggers back and forth like this. When you got 4 points of contact on the ground, that swagger is not nearly as exaggerated. Don't make your bow so heavy in weight. Just draw enough weight that you're comfortable with it. What's more important is that you can hold your bow for 2 minutes drawn if you have to. And still, shoot 50 pounds, shoot 55 pounds, shoot just enough to where you've got enough kinetic energy at an efficient range, at 30, 35, 40 yards to still get a pass-through lung shot on that deer, The blood trail may not be as easy to follow as a deer that is shot from a downward angle out of a tree stand, because when you do that, you've got a low exit hole. That blood is going to fill up to that low exit hole in those lungs, and then it's going to start exiting. Until it reaches that hole, the blood is probably not going to leave much of a trail. Well, when you're shooting at a deer that is a little more on level ground with you, if you're hunting on level ground, on the ground, your shot may be perfectly level when you shoot the deer. And so it may take a while for that blood to build up to that hole. So really pay attention when you're ground hunting on level ground to the direction that deer runs off to. Carry a compass with you, okay? A compass with a rotatable index. Learn how to use it, Point that compass north, the needle, get the needle pointing north, and then turn that arrow dial to the direction in the tree where you last saw that deer. And then when you get up and you move to a different location, use that compass to keep pointing you in that direction, that general direction where that deer went, so that you don't know. Because sometimes you may have to walk for 100 yards before you find first blood because it had to fill up to that level hit before it started really exiting from the lungs. But once it gets up to that level, I don't think you're going to have a hard time finding the trail, because once it starts coming out of both those holes at the same time, it's going to be everywhere. It's going to be plastered on every piece of vegetation on either side of that deer where it ran. It's going to be a lot easier to find that blood trail if you mark with the compass where you need to look. Because like I say, you may have to go a ways before you can find that blood. And you owe it to that animal to give every effort possible to try and recover that deer,
I think one thing that intimidates folks when it comes to hunting on the ground, whether it's bow hunting or rifle hunting, is just staying concealed and not being busted when they're on the ground. So what are some rules of thumb? Like you mentioned one right there, like try to sit behind the tree, try to be above the deer. Are there any other rules of thumb that you have about staying concealed?
Yes, if you use any kind of ground vegetation to your cover, or to your advantage. If you've got some ground cover around, you can take a few branches and set around the tree around you, not so high up to the point, or if that you can't shoot over it. Or if you've got one of those screw-in tree umbrellas or something like that, they can be staked into the ground to where you can use it as a blind in front of the tree that you're sitting behind. If you can't sit behind a tree, look for a fallen tree. Get in the crown of that tree. If you've got a tree, parallel to the ridge and you're wanting to hunt, downhill from that tree, if it's a big enough tree and it's fallen over, you might not have to sit in the crown of the tree. You might be able to just sit right behind that tree to where the only thing that's seen is your head. And I would highly advise that you always wear gloves and you always wear a head net. If you're not going to wear a head net, at least paint your face, because I think deer pick out light colors pretty easily, especially for somebody like Jacob.
I come built in with my own blaze orange right here.
Built-in blaze.
I was gonna ask if you do any like ghillie suit or leaf suit or anything
Yes,
like
a
that.
leafy
too.
suit. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I usually
You wear that
during
every
the early season when I'm bow hunting. Yeah, I'll usually carry a light like leafy suit. It's like an over leafy suit. I'll wear just plain camo underneath, carry the leafy suit in my backpack, and then when I go to set up and get where I'm going, then I put the leafy suit on, because the leafy suits, they easily get torn by briars and things like that you pass through. So if you want to make it last for a while, stick it inside your backpack, carry it in. Then when you get to where you're hunting, then throw that thing on before you sit down and you start hunting once you found the location that you want to hunt in. So yeah, a leafy suit works wonders. Breaks your outline really, really well. If you're hunting close to the top of the ridge, make sure you're down far enough to where you've got some mountain behind your back if you're hunting in the mountains, Don't hunt to where you can be skylined easily. You got to stay down off the top of the ridge. Even if the sign is really great up there, stay down far enough to where you don't get silhouetted by the skyline from deer looking uphill. You have to keep that in mind, just as you do as a tree stand hunter. You don't want to be skylined. Like I said, you use natural cover to your advantage. The thing that's great about the turkey seat, like if you're sitting on the top of a ridge looking onto a circular trail that's going around one of these saddles, you don't necessarily have to have a tree. A lot of times in these saddles, you can just find brushy cover that you can tuck back into and just prune a couple of limbs if you have to, just to get that shooting lane right out in front of you when the deer circles around. Just be innovative and just use whatever you see around you to your advantage. If it's not a big tree, it needs to be something. Otherwise, you're going to get busted when you draw. Exception to the rule, if you don't have anything to put around you and a deer comes in and you're not prepared, wait for the deer to put its head down. Wait for the deer to get its head preferably behind a tree or something so that you can get drawn, because that's what's going to give you away, is just going through that drawing motion. Once you've got that bow drawn, as long as you're not pulling 90 pounds to where you're doing this, as long as you know what your manageable weight is and what you can handle, and hold steady for a couple of minutes, you're not going to get busted. All you got to do is just wait for that animal to step out away from that tree, and then you've got that open shot.
Is there anything that you do vastly different if you're setting up, say, on a steep hill and you're looking down at where you think the deer are going to be, versus if you're hunting something like one of those ridge flats where maybe you're more eye level with where the deer are going to be?
Well, with the ridge flats, usually they're not that wide in most of the places that I hunt. They might be in some places that I haven't found yet, and if they did, I would probably hunt on the back side of the flat, right where the mountain starts to, take its uphill plunge, But for a narrow flat, I'd hunt it like I do a bench. I would stay above it on the higher ground so that I don't have any scent pulling in the area of that flat, and I would have the thermal advantage as well as a sight advantage. If I'm up higher, odds are if a deer is walking that flat, I'm going to see it sooner than if I'm sitting down on the level with it. So I would always prefer to be a little bit above in level in any hunting scenario, any situation if possible.
That makes sense.
Also, when you're ground hunting, one thing I've learned about ground hunting for deer is it's very similar to turkey hunting, where like I can get caught up, like when I'm up in the tree and like in the saddle, I can get caught up like, I'll play on my phone for a little bit, whatever. One thing I've learned ground hunting, both deer and turkey, if you think you're in the game, it slows down. Like you really can't do that because your movement's so much exaggerated on the ground because you're eye level with a deer.
Yeah, it is.
Do you do anything specifically about mentally being focused? Like how do you focus on being focused when sitting on the ground and always having your eyes moving around and not trying to get distracted? I mean,
well, first of all, I'm legally blind in my left eye. I was born that way, and so it's hard for me to cover my left-hand side, without actually having to turn my head, But when I'm on the ground, I'm turning my head and moving most of the time. You just have to do it slow as molasses. Don't make quick, jerky movements. And as far as just being prepared to do that and to have what it takes to force yourself to be in that mental scenario, a lot of that is pounding it into your head. Talk to yourself. Make notes. Write it down. Write it down over and over. Don't just write it once. Write it again and again and again. Things that you write down tend to stay in your subconscious mind. Practice the scenario. When you're at home and you're out shooting in your backyard, practice moving slow. Don't move fast. Practice it any chance you get, and that's going to make it more comfortable and more natural for you to do. Second thing, get a good night's rest. If you don't get a good night's rest, your mind is not 100% in the game. I think if you find that you've eaten well, you've been nourished well, and you've gotten a good night's rest, you may have to sacrifice a little bit of hunting time to get a good night's rest, but it's worth it because that way you can concentrate and keep your mind in the game for the time that you are out there hunting, and I think that's a lot more important.
Yeah, that's excellent. Also, when ground hunting, do you do anything different when it comes to taking a rifle or muzzleloader out versus when you're bow hunting?
Yes. I mean, I feel it's a whole lot more forgiving. Most of the places that I hunt in the mountains, if I see a deer, usually I'm going to see it more than 100 yards away coming to me. And by the time it's there, it's dead. I'm a pretty good shot. And so I don't usually miss, and if I did, I'm going to catch it from my oldest son. So I can't afford to miss. I don't want to hear it. And he don't want to hear it from me either because I'll do the same thing to him. So I just relax a little bit. When I'm gun hunting on the ground, I don't usually bother wearing a head net. I still wear gloves, because you're going to have to pull that gun up. But the deer are farther away. It's much less likely that they're going to recognize your face, especially if you have any type of beard growth that's natural like y'all guys do. Grow a beard during hunting season. It will definitely pay benefits, especially if you're pale-skinned, But that's really the difference mainly is, I still try and move very slowly. I still try and set up my stand if I can behind a tree. And what I'll usually do is I'll lean my muzzleloader or my gun right on the back side of that tree right there. And the reason why I like to be behind a tree is a lot of times, if you see a deer a little farther than 100 yards away, 150 yards, whatever, and you have to make that shot, you can stand, if that tree's wider than you are, it's real easy to stand up behind that tree, grab your gun, slide it around the side of the tree, and use that tree as a rest to steady your shot so you can make those long range shots without having to do it offhand and risk missing the shot, Get a rest if you can get it, Anytime there's any kind of a rest when you're rifle hunting, take it,
So, Andrew, do you have anything else on ground hunting?
No.
Okay, I've got a couple other questions. One, I'm going to throw you a curveball here, which, Andrew, this is that question I was telling you about for doing like a series.
Oh yeah.
So, I want to know, first off, with you hunting the mountains as much as you have, remote places and stuff like that, have you ever had any, sketchy encounters, whether it's with wildlife, I don't know if you have any bear encounters, or steep areas, slips and falls, anything like that, or anything other kind of crazy things that's happened to you?
Yeah, just last season, I fell into a hole in the ground in the dark walking in that I didn't know it was there. I mean, I didn't my whole body fall in a hole, but my leg went down into a deep hole in the ground. And I wear leather boots in the mountains. I don't bother with rubber boots. And boy, after hearing the episode, I don't know what the episode number is, but the one where y'all talk about ground scent and how every little piece of rock and vegetation and soil that you disturb, creates ground scent. After learning all of that, it's like, why wear rubber boots? Why worry about it? So I'm going to wear stuff with an aggressive tread that will get good traction on the rocks. And, I have thin ankles, so I need good ankle support. So I'm going to wear a 10-inch boot, 10-inch boot usually, preferably something that isn't heavy as a ton of bricks, something that's light, but yet, comfortable and rigid, So, what was the actual question?
You said you fell in a hole.
Yeah. I fell in a hole. Yeah. So I accidentally stepped in this hole and it went down past my knee. And those boots, you can't flex your toes in them. They're straight and they're pretty rigid the way that they're made. And so I had a heck of a time trying to get my leg out of this doggone hole. And I actually had to dump all my gear and lay down on the ground and pull on my leg to free it from this hole. And I finally did get it out after about 5 minutes. That was kind of a weird encounter. Don't usually have things like that happen. I've had a bear come in on me once, a mother with a couple of cubs when I was archery hunting, and the cubs were making their way up the mountain, feeding in a draw directly toward me, and they got within about 50 yards, and Mama was right behind them, and she was big and bad. And I was afraid they were going to walk right into my lap, and I had already knocked an arrow. I was actually checking a deer camera when I saw them, so I just got behind a big tree and kneeled on the ground, and when they got within 50 yards, by the time they had got to 60, I'd already knocked an arrow and had my bow and release attached, and I was ready just in case I had to shoot Mama, which I didn't want to do, Thank God in heaven they took a 90, the cubs did, and Mama followed them. But that's one kind of close encounter with a bear that was, you don't want to get between a mother and her cubs. There have been times when I've come upon sounders of hogs in the dark, on the way well up high on the mountain, and had to jump on a fallen tree, to keep Mama from attacking me. I've had that happen before. I've had some places that were so remote that I actually had to leave the house at midnight early on when I was much younger and hunted really harder when I first started. And first started hunting out here in the mountains, where I'd go in at midnight. The place was so remote and so high, and I would walk and climb from midnight to get there pre-dawn, and I encountered a bear in the darkness on the finger ridge right next to the finger ridge that I was on that did not like me being in that area and started popping its jaws at me in the dark. And that is the only time I've ever been in the woods at night where the hair actually stood up on the back of my neck. And I just couldn't do anything really except just freeze and hope that the bear would leave. And eventually it did after about 15 minutes.
Nope. I don't like that.
But I'll tell you what, if I had my druthers, I'd much rather run into a bear in the woods than a wild hog any day of the week. Them hogs are very mean and they are very unpredictable. 9 times out of 10, from my experience, a bear is going to turn and leave. It might take a few minutes, I think the only exception to that rule would probably be if a bear is starving and hungry and there's just nothing to eat but you. I think that's really the only dangerous black bear in the woods.
Oh, I don't like that one bit. I don't like that at all.
Well, that's a realistic scenario, and it can happen,
Yeah, I've heard, with a grizzly bear, oh, you play dead. I've heard people be like, don't do that with a black bear because it'll just eat you.
I think if it was hungry, it probably would. But my advice would be if a black bear doesn't back away, back away from it and yell at it. Wave your hands. Make yourself look larger than you really are. Yell at it, try and intimidate it. Even throw a rock at it if you have to, Mm-hmm. Just don't run. Whatever you do, do not turn and run, because it's instinct to chase whatever runs, just like it is in dogs or any other predator animal. They're going to chase what runs away from them. A bear will do the same thing. Do not turn and run. Just back away from it slowly.
Awesome. Well, Chuck, other than that, appreciate you letting us come to your house and do this interview.
I am so glad to have
been-
y'all
it's been a
here.
while.
It's great to finally be on YouTube and have an actual body attached to the
the
voices
voice.
that I've talked to for quite a few hours now.
Yeah.
And like I say, I really admire what y'all guys are doing. And any listeners out there, if you're not listening to this podcast, you should be. There's not a lot of deer material out there that pertains to particularly southern deer hunting. These guys are the shiznit. They're what you need to be listening to, man. They have a lot of really keen people on the show that have a lot of great information to give, and they have great information to give themselves also on their own experiences, on their rebuttals after the show. And they're a couple of pleasant, great personalities, and they're funny as hell. So
Appreciate that, man.
listen up, everybody. Watch. If you can't watch, listen. It's a lot to be gained, man. Y'all have a great thing going, and I wish you many years of luck. And I hope we can see each other again.
Yeah,
man. And
sure.
until we do, good luck. And I hope I've given you something that maybe you can use. And I'm hoping I've given everybody out there something that they can use, especially young people that are getting into it. Yeah. Maybe a lot of what I might have said may have been ridiculously simple, but some people need that. And I care more about helping the people that are starting than the people that are already established. They already know what to do. They already know everything that I'm saying. I don't have much to offer them, but I do have something to offer people that want to learn a little bit that are starting, and I hope I've helped them.
Absolutely. Well, Chuck, we greatly appreciate it. And for all the viewers out there, thank y'all for watching the podcast. Thank y'all for listening to the podcast. And we'll catch you back here the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsman. And remember, guys, y'all stay Southern.